Hello, everybody. Thank you for viewing my presentation. My name is Andrei. I'm an assistant lecturer at the University of Bucharest. And so today I will be talking about the very popular action-adventure RPG game Horizon Zero Dawn. And as you can see, the title of this presentation is Simulating an Entrepreneurial Ecosystem in Horizon Zero Dawn, Initiative, Accumulation, and the critique of capitalism. So basically, what I want to do is analyze the extent to which the game naturalizes capitalism and the manner in which, of course, this is achieved. So a few words about the game first. As already mentioned, this is an action-adventure game. Which has many of the conventions of the RPG. So you basically control a character in an open world setting where you have to amass a series of resources and by managing the resources correctly, eventually beat the game. The story of the game is also very, very interesting. The events are set in a very distant future, but although it is a very distant future, people live in very in a very primitive society. The cause for this, we learn as we play, is that at some point in the near future, humanity was extinct as a result of basically artificial intelligence gaining the upper hand and extinguishing humanity. What happens is that before dying, some of the humans managed to set up an AI, which once the entire human race has been extinguished, it could then rebuild the atmosphere and enable life to grow again on Earth. So that's basically a very brief summary of the game's plot. Now, the structure of this presentation is going to be as follows. So the point for me is to analyze the way in which the game naturalizes capitalism. So I will first briefly discuss the issue of in-game economy and how this is related to ideology. Then look at two contradicting aspects of the game. Firstly, I look at the game's critique of capitalism, and then I show how, in fact, if you look at the gameplay, what we're actually dealing with is a endorsement of capitalism. So these two things that don't really go hand in hand, and then elaborate on this contradiction and show how we are apparently dealing with a form of rhetorical dissonance. So let's commence. Now, what is an in-game economy? Typically, in video games where you have this open world setting, or in strategy games where you have to, control massive armies or nations or groups of playable characters, you have a inbuilt algorithm for trade. So, in other words, the worlds simulated by many video games have economies. That is, you gain resources which can then be traded for money, which can then be traded with which one can later buy objects which are relevant for gameplay. If you have a look at most of the mainstream video games out there, you'll notice that these economies are all capitalist, right? So the way games simulate economy is a typically capitalist one. Now, what is interesting about these games is that the simulation of capitalism is a very idealist one, i.e. you never get a version of, it's very seldom the case that you get a version of capitalism with all its flaws and minuses and variety of features that come up with when capitalism is implemented in a particular region. So it's all this ideal version of capitalism which is very well tied to the ideology of meritocracy. So if you're good in a game, then if you perform well, then you can amass many resources which can then be traded for relevant objects which make it easier for you to beat the game in the end. Now, what is problematic about the way in which games simulate capitalist economy is not only the fact that this economy is an ideal capitalist economy where meritocracy actually works, but rather that by means of immersion, what these games do is naturalize capitalism. I mean, the procedural rhetoric of a video game is that, to quote a classical book in the humanities, there is no alternative, right? So capitalism is simulated in such a manner so as to contest the possibility of any other economic system existing out there or being viable, which is a very neoliberal thing to do. Coming back to, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, right? So that's how in-game economies work from an ideological perspective in video games. Let's see how this is the case with Horizon Zero Dawn as well. Now, contrary to what you might expect, actually, if you look at the embedded narrative, i.e., the background of the events that lead to the extinction of the human race, events which you discover or learn about the more you get to play, you see that on this very overt superficial narrative level, what you have is a very strong critique of capitalism. So basically, many of the tenets of the left-wing critique of capitalism that we hear today, or that we read about in the press, or we hear from politicians such as Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn, you've got this all there implemented in the embedded narrative. You have this idea of so the idea of the game is that the extinction of the human race is caused by the privatization of the public sector, automation, climate crisis, and, well, of course, corporate greed. So you've got all these factors there that eventually lead to, well, the extinction of humankind, and then, well, its rebirth is unfortunately not so. Its rebirth actually leads them back to a pre-modern stage in which they have to, be hunter-gatherers again, right? Okay, so yeah, an overt critique of capitalism on a narrative level. However, if we move beyond this, superficial critique of capitalism and have a look at the gameplay proper, we will notice that, in fact, what we're dealing with here is an endorsement of capitalism. So, gameplay. As already mentioned, typically the in-game economy simulated by video games pay tribute to, capitalist thinking. In this game as well, which overtly is a critique, which overtly functions or claims to be a critique of capitalism, you have the same capitalist in-game economy very much at work. So, for instance, you have to gather resources which regenerate infinitely, for instance, trade them for better weapons, which then enable you, the player, to be more successful in the game. Now, what is interesting about this in-game economies, in particular, this in-game economy of Horizon Zero Dawn, is that you have this very, if you wish, accurate simulation of this idea of this ideal concept of entrepreneurial ecosystem. So basically, the world of a video game is itself a ecosystem where you have to be able to use your entrepreneurial skill to identify opportunities and to use these opportunities in a lucrative manner so as to accumulate more resources, more metal shards. The metal shard is the currency of the world in in the video game I'm discussing here, right? So this is where we are. So on the one hand, the game's narrative conveys a critique of capitalism. On the other hand, gameplay, especially its in-game economy, is a very capitalist one. So how does this game position itself to a entire history of the RPG genre, which very much praises capitalism as, you know, the spearhead of progress, for instance? Let's see how this happens. So my claim is that what we're dealing with here is a form of, sorry, there's a typo here. Digital play. Okay. So I regard this antithesis between the embedded narrative and the game simulation, i.e. gameplay, as a form of rhetorical dissonance. So video games as multimodal media communicate on various levels. On the one hand, there is the linear set of events which is embedded in the game, and we call this the linear means of representation. In our case, the narrative means of representation, which expresses overt critique of capitalism. And on the other hand, so besides this scripted series of events which engenders this meaning which is tantamount to a critique of capitalism, you have the simulation, i.e. gameplay, that part of the game where you are in an interactive feedback loop with the game engine, and the buttons that you push on your controller or on your keyboard have a direct effect on what happens in the game world. If we look at the way the unfolding of the proper game works out in Horizon Zero Dawn, you've got this covert endorsement of capitalism. Okay, so we draw the conclusion that this is a rhetorical dissonance, or a modal dissonance, if you wish, to quote Rhetorical, because on its various planes, the game communicates contending meanings. However, I would like to go a step further and rely on a quotation, for instance, from from a canonical work in game studies called Digital Play. You have the bibliographical information here on your on the PowerPoint presentation. So let me just read this quotation for you. The games industry, like the rest of popular culture, has learned that irony is a no-lose gambit, a have your cake and eat it too strategy, whose simultaneous affirmation negation structure can give the appearance of social critique and retract it in the same moment, thereby letting everything stay just as it is, while allowing practitioners to feel safely above it all, even if they sink more deeply in. So the idea, so what the authors of this book very astutely remark is that you often have video games which have this appearance of being progressive, which touch upon a variety of issues which are regarded progressive and well, anti-establishment, but they do so only to make players less aware of the very conservative ideology which undergirds that particular game. And this is also the case with Horizon Zero Dawn. So what you have here is this very formulaic critique of capitalism along the very same lines that we are familiar with from the press that we have been reading for the past years. Well, at least some of the press. I'm talking about that part of the press which endorses the left, right? So we have this appearance of critique, which, you know, being overt is supposed to convince you from the very beginning that you're dealing with an anti-capitalist game. But underneath this glance of anti-capitalism lies a very neoliberal, meritocratic, hardcore capitalist economy, which structures gameplay without the player actually being aware of it, because he's convinced of the narrative by the embedded narrative, that in fact he is playing, or he or she is playing a anti-capitalist game. So to sum up, Horizon Zero Dawn is an action adventure video game that that uses anti-capitalist discourse precisely as a means to better naturalize capitalism, to better strengthen, reinforce the idea that, look, capitalism is the only economic system out there. There is no other way. There is no way of mitigating it in any way. And in this sense, game studies can be a very important important field of research, because we in game studies can have the critical methodological tools to highlight the ideological underpinnings of video games. Thank you very much for your attention.